Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here, get for Gnosis. Well, in my continuing presentation of Satanism and Satanic cults, I want to cover the Temple of Set. I'm pretty much the authority on this planet on Satanic cults and their operation, as I've been studying them for, I guess, about 35, 40 years now. When I first came in contact with them through certain media, Roy Hollywood Tuckman on KPFK, I think it is, in Los Angeles, who is still operating, and we highly recommend you go there. And I don't know if he's playing these at that time, but there was a time when he was playing a lot of information and interviews on particularly the Temple of Set and its founder, Michael Aquino. And of course, there's other ones we've all heard about, the Church of Satan, which is still operating, the Anton LaVey organization, who has since passed away. So is Michael Aquino. He has passed away about a year ago in 2021, I believe, from colon cancer in his early 70s. There are the Temple of Vampires, and there's different satanic texts, groups that have been around. Most of these groups did not get along, but there was all of a sudden a organization of all these satanic groups that kind of get along with each other and work together. The Temple of the Vampire, I don't know if they're still operating. They were a fairly big organization. The Church of Satan, of course, the Temple of Set. There's many other offshoots to this in the recent years. And it's unknown whether they actually, how much they're working together. But at one time, they constantly used to fight, and that's no longer the case. They tend to reference each other on websites and other things. Now, the Temple of Set's an interesting organization. In terms of the history of satanic cults, they've been around forever, and people have been twisting or worshiping for their own personal perversion different satanic figures. There are some groups that actually took positive, and this has always been, the gods of the past are the demons of the present. So you demonize, when you take over a culture, they're actually God forms. Or if you are trying to disrespect and disregard a culture, as it happened with the worship of Saturn, which some of that is now turned into it was an old Roman god, and there was nothing overly, matter of fact, it was a positive figure, but certain groups took Saturn and turned it into Satan. So I don't know if that's the fact because the first three letters are the same. That would be the mentality of a Satanist. We have a planet called Saturn. Is that really Satan? So all these things get distorted and things get very complicated because life is really about individual people taking on something and then changing it to their personal belief system, their personal area, culture, etc. So this is what happens with everything. So there's no pure representation of anything. I'm assuming this happens with most things, even with more traditional churches. They're going to be different in the South than they are in California, and they're going to be different in California than they are in Oregon or other places. So there's going to be a regional change to belief systems, and of course there are nation changes, etc. So there are differences in organizations unless they have a very strong dogma and enforce that. But there's always changes, there's always attitudes that are different, etc. So we have to understand that. But let's get into the foundations of what Satanism is. What is their belief system? And there is a unity to this understanding. The basic understanding of a Satanist is the fact that they can become God. Now, this is what a lot of Christians criticize the New Age movement for. And the New Age movement tends to state this, but they're not stating it in the satanic way. They're stating it more in, you have the God capacity within you. You can do everything. As such, God is within you, and you are this better being. Now, that's not what the Satanists believe. The Satanists, including the E.A. Konedding, who organization is named that, Become a God. So That's their philosophy. So this runs through Satanism and is no different with the Church of Satan. So you can become a god. You have that power. You don't need to scrape and kneel to others. And that's the reality of it. And of course, that goes back to the original story of the war in heaven between the different angels, where the fallen angels, or who would become the fallen angels, were thrown out of heaven because they didn't want to worship mankind and take care of them. They wanted to be their own. They wanted to also not worship God. They wanted to be their own gods. So there was a war that went on headed by the general, I guess you could call him, St. Michael, who threw out Lucifer, Satan, and all his other little crumb bugs that didn't really want to conform to society. They didn't want to go along and help the growth of mankind and everyone else. They wanted to be on their own personal ego trip. They don't need anybody else. They don't want anybody else. I am God. Is the basic philosophy of all Satanists. And it's unfortunate, and I'm not sure if New Agers actually know it, but when you start talking like that, you're a ignorant boob that plays into the basic satanic understanding of a life. So you are not God. You have no idea what God is, and this goes for these goofball Satanists who are nothing more than egotistical maniacs delving into the lowest level chakras and their confused philosophies. So they're just dealing from root chakra energies, low level, low consciousness, that I want to be my own dictator. And with what? What do you know? Now, to be a scraping, kneeling, groveling worshiper is no good either. And of course, that's how they see most Christians. And unfortunately, that's true to a very large extent. The Christian churches tell you that you cannot pick your own destiny. You leave your destiny in God's hands and he tells you what to do. Well, that's a pretty bad policy, because if you allow your life to be flopped around by some unknown, impotent God form that the Christian mythology preaches, you're in trouble. But that's their philosophy. That's why they're against any kind of direct practices, and particularly practical witchcraft, which is generating energies around you to draw to you what you need. I'm poor, I need money, so let's do a money ritual. So, and what's wrong with that? They tell you to pray. Pray is just another ritual. You're concentrating psychic energy. You get in prayer groups. You're just basically using psychic energy to push it around there. You're just disguising it as coming through some being, which seems to be the problem with the human race, of their weakness of having to give up their power to somebody else. And of course, this is the philosophy of a lot of Satanists. But, the problem is that they're not really balanced. You get into that ego, you get into that power, and it's always misused. Certainly, a Gnostic viewpoint should understand the fact of what's going on in this life, an only practical belief system, that this is a hell plane, we're in hell, nothing works out properly, and we need to escape it. That's the real practical belief systems, and most ancient religions kind of have the same thing. The gods are very unpredictable. They can be very helpful and generous. On the other hand, they can be very strange and unpredictable. Why do the best people get sick? Why do the best people, the best fighters, get killed in battle? This doesn't make sense. So this is because that's how the world is. And to try and clean it up by some fake goofball comic book story of some love god doesn't work. We don't live in that reality, and we never will. And the people that follow these people tend to be some of the lowest out there. So this feeds. You could say that Satanism was created by Christianity. And of course, the Christians themselves have pushed a lot of people away because of their very negative ways. I've never met a smart religious person, period. I've never met a nice Christian or anybody else. These are all people that are really nasty. And they think they are special because they're with God. And they're going to step on, hurt, and murder anybody they can. And they also support all the criminals in the society that they think are part of society by supporting them and persecuting good people. And they're very easily bought, and they're cowards, and they always have been. So What does that do? Well, if you're a person who wants to think for themselves and who's kind of strong and maybe wants to do something, well, you tend to be attracted to the satanic path. As one person told me many years ago, and I've heard it from a few, well, that's the strong path. Those are the doer path. They're not the kneelers and the cheek turners and the bugger types that you get with Christians who can't wait to run and scream and, oh, we'll forgive our enemies, kill me. Well, that's the kind of attitude you get into. So this is what? So the tenets of Satanism is that I can become God. I don't need another God. I have that within me. And to a certain extent, this is taught to everybody, no matter what tradition you go into. These self-help people that say you can manifest anything, you can do this, are really saying that you are God to a large extent. But, God is a terrible term to use. You do have great empowerment. There are ways to connect to super levels of manifesting and empowerments, but you don't become a god. You're nothing but a channel. And there's where the difference comes in. First of all, we have no idea what God is. But God is, if we want to define God, and it's important in this discussion, is a energy manifesting reality. What really does God do to begin with? He makes everything. So if you're a god, you have to be able to manifest anything, make planets, make something out of nothing, create that. And this is not really possible. That's the God force, the creative energy that created, if we want to go into scientific lingo, created the Big Bang, produced planets, produced this, did everything else. So the essence of everything is God is the creator. He makes everything. Now, how much control is in there is another point. A real creator energy doesn't really control anything. You create it, you throw it out there, and then it's up to that energy to do what it wants, and that makes a lot more sense. If a god is supposed to be controlling everything, which is what basically most religions tell you, well, then there's a really big problem because we live in a horrible sewer. And then there gets to be endless arguments and discussions of, well, free will, this or that. But it really isn't free will. We don't live in a place where we can live up to our higher potential. We have to get down in the dew, the feces of life, the stinking urine smell of reality to get by every day. You've got to have a job, and if that job includes doing something that's not very nice or even helps the environment, well, you got to do it anyway. So it's not a world built like that. Everything is against you, pushing you down and corrupting you. This becomes suffering, and suffering does not teach anything. So the whole idea was to and of course, Buddhism says this, the end of suffering is what Buddhism is supposed to be about, so that you can then go on to a higher level of consciousness. The problem with Buddhism is just as bad as everything else, even though it has a nicer gloss. But the bottom line is that that's what Satanists believe. Now, all other religions will tell you to go to a higher level, to feed energy from this pure source, to then be an empowered good person, following someone else's beliefs. That's what religion is. You follow someone else's belief. If you're spiritual, you follow your own beliefs. But the dogma of religion, considering that it is perpetrated, followed through, and organized by the most scummiest energy on the planet, the human race, well, what are you going to get from that? If you mix poo and urine together and you add a drop of nice spice to it, it's still stinky urine. So it's just no way around it. And that's, of course, what happens. So religions have been around for thousands of years and done nothing. So let's get back to say that's what they believe. Now, the problem with this is while it intellectually caters to anybody who's got any kind of balls and makes you a freer person, not being under the auspices of some reverend or someone else who's supposed to be higher than you or has spent his time, his full time, he's paid to bring divine word to you, to help you on the path. This never really happens. It turns into dogma, and I don't know, I've never had any, it's like teachers and everything else. I've never personally had any help, but I don't know anybody else that has. So the whole idea is that it's a big illusion. I don't see churches doing anything, and when they're confronted by problems, they run like the cowards they are. Now, I don't think the Satanists are any better. I don't think Satanists are going to stand up for anything or fight for anybody or do anything else. They're in it for themselves. It's an egotistical thing. Now, the bottom line is when you work from ego, well, basically, what's new about this? The Satanic Bible, which the Temple of Set is based upon, and the founder of the Temple of Set was involved in for, 10 years or more, it's all just about ego. And there's nothing overly shocking in the Satanic Bible as far as I'm concerned. It says, stand up, somebody punches you, punch him back harder. You take what you want. You're a person who has ego and sex, and you should live out of that. Of course, all of society lives this way. So there's really nothing new about this teaching. I kind of yawn. This is kind of a twisted Machiavellian type book. This is just the prince written for modern times. So, the strong survive, all this. So what's new about this stuff? Nothing. And that's how the world works. I mean, your basic philosophy of me, myself, and I is how the world runs. And people love that under the gauze, the guise, this thin veneer of that we're doing this for the greater good. I mean, this is pretty much the attitude of everybody. We see this with particularly in the United States, with the Republican Party, which is all about myself and I. Under the fact we're doing this for everybody. Well, you're not doing it. You're doing it for yourself, and you shouldn't have proper housing, you shouldn't have proper schooling, you shouldn't have proper clean air, or anything else. All of this doesn't matter as long as you got money in your pocket and you have your little house. Because after all, Jesus wants you to suffer. If Jesus came back, first thing he would do is he'd make sure the rivers were filthy, that the housing was, people were living on the streets, they had no medical care. Yeah, that's the good Jesus energy. But that's what these Christians preach, and they help nobody. We've had 2,000 years of that belief system with the thousands of variants of it, and where has the world gotten to? Nowhere. And people are sick and tired of that belief system. The largest religion growth on this planet, by far, is the very egotistically based low chakra religion of Islam, which is taking over, and within 50 years will be the majority of people on this planet, and another 50 years will take over. Plain and simple. Certainly, the weak need do-nothing Christians will achieve nothing. There's nothing in Christianity that anybody cares about. It's nonsense. Anybody that thinks that love is going to change the world is pretty naive. So this is all the things that drive Satanism and, of course, makes it attractive to anybody who's semi-free thinking. But the problem is they're not free thinking. They live in a dogma. So that's behind everything is that like E.O.S. Kennedy's organization, Become a Living God, that's what it's all about. So, empowering yourself is important. Becoming a god is ridiculous. So it's kind of a childish comic book term to use, but they're tapping into the lowest capacity of everybody. And of course, what is your alternative? All the nonsense, the lack of help, the horrible atrocities that the Christians have committed and continue to commit, the millions of people they murdered in the Inquisition and tortured to death. Is that what you're supposed to do? The lack of holding on to their own country? Islam occupied Portugal and Spain for 900 years and is now taking over the world. They conquered Constantinople and hold it. This is the people that you're going to follow, these weak-kneed people. But they had the guts and the weapons to torture and murder all the so-called witches, so they could steal their land and everything else. The corruption involved there, and the corruption in the church is just staggering even today, with the Vatican that has trillions, which is nothing really more than a satanic order. So what do you say? Oh, well, you sound like a Satanist. Well, those are just facts. The point is that you clean the mess up that you have. You don't throw everything away and join the opposition. The opposition is no better. The bottom line is that Satanism opens a door to every possible excuse for your own ego to do every possible atrocity and debauchery you possibly can think of. So the whole idea is all of it, and it's all mixed up into a big gobbledygook of lies and so forth. So the Temple of Set, and it's important to understand this because this is what it's all. So the Temple of Set basically believes that. It was started, and all of its belief systems are based on Anton LaVey. They broke away from Anton LaVey, I believe, was it 70? Let me check that. Let's go back here. It was founded in 1975 by Michael Aquino, the lieutenant colonel with an intelligence background and even a special forces badge, apparently. So he was, Anton LaVey was a big failure. He never made any money. He had a little spark. He was, just because you're in a couple of films and you have a best-selling paperback novel doesn't make you a lot of money. At the time of his divorce, which destroyed the Church of Satan completely, he was claiming a $20,000 a year income. He didn't really have any money. He died basically in poverty with nothing, and the house that was there that he lived in, that someone else bought for him and let him live there, was eventually torn down. But everybody deserted him in the church, including his own daughter, who became a member of the Temple of Set in her own little group. So I don't know what the problem there is, but this happens with everything. All leaders tend to be hated by their fake, traitorous disciples, so to speak. And the fact that he finally wanted to make a little bit of money out of the church so that he could live better and even have money to take the church to higher levels, which is really impossible. You're not going to sell this to the public, regardless of the fact that most people live a satanic lifestyle. It's as simple as that. That's what everything is based on. Me, myself, and I, and everybody doesn't care. No matter what you drape yourself in, the bottom line is that's where you're living from. So their whole concept is nothing new, as I've already stated. So at that time, Anton LaVey was sick of it all. He was not making money. He did a film. He had a book. He wasn't having much income. At the time of his divorce, his income was stated as $20,000 a year. He died in poverty in a house that someone else bought for him. I don't know if I said that already or not, but I think it's important to know. So there was a reason for him to try and monetize the church a little more. He wanted to offer things to people that, look, you're a successful person. You can buy a title in the church. And I see nothing wrong with this. You have to make money, and a Satanist should be more understanding of how the world works than anyone else, and they should be lusting off of money. Isn't that really their base level urges? Now, Michael Aquino didn't care with his big lieutenant colonel salary, his rich mommy, and all the privileges that he had throughout his entire life, living in the lap of luxury, basically having a very candy-ass life being a military officer. I mean, being an officer in the military is a candy-ass life. Everything is given to you. You have all this rank. You do what you want. And, of course, he did. And very few people in the military see any really serious action, even in a big war. So, most people are support. Very few people are in the front lines ultimately, or even in danger. Even though apparently Aquino did go to Vietnam at one time, and I'm not sure his involvement or not, but of how much action he really saw. But and he also had a Green Beret Special Forces, apparently, badge that he completed their training, whatever that means. A lot of that is given to officers just for going. I mean, you do have to complete things, but it's kind of a rubber stamp. But getting into the template, so that was it. He didn't like that, Aquino, and him and the other more serious intellectual types there, the more dangerous types that really weren't into the same kind of play and partying that Anton LaVey was. That's Michael Aquino, that's Edred Flowers, and several other people who then formed the kind of core of the Temple of Set. Edred Flowers, who headed the Trapezoid Order, but the Trapezoid Order, which was which all of the Temple of Set is based on, basically based in Nazism, and we'll get into that in a minute. The Temple of Trapezoid, which was a division of particular Nazi magic, was started by Anton LaVey. And there's always this connection. I did an actual little video on Satanism and Nazism, which is pretty much the same thing. They have the same attitudes, and it's just, a very base level of operating. It's a very root chakra, force and murder reality, and that's very much into it. Now, one of the things that has to be when you say that, so Aquino decided to invent this entire Temple of Set and claimed to have an occult epiphany and met Set, etc. You also have to understand that Set is the Egyptian Satan, to make it quick and simple. So Set is a destructive, heat, death, disease, god form out of the Egyptian pantheon. And of course, it's very confusing because everything is very confusing. But if you want to keep things kind of black and white for reasons of discussion here, he was the negative entity. He killed his brother. There's a whole complicated story there to understand it. So he had that, and he says Satan came to him and said that I'm really Set, and this is how it started. Convenient at the same time he wanted to break away from the Church of Satan. And that's exactly what happened. So they didn't like that. And of course, he did need money, as I said, having wealthy parents and everything else. So, and he really wasn't involved in the Church of Satan very heavily either. He was and I don't want to necessarily cover this twice here, but he was the newsletter writer, because nobody wants to do that. Michael Aquino. And this is a job that they always turn over to guys like him who have the time and energy to do that kind of tedious, boring work. So, I mean, that's why the Temple of Set was started. And but the people that formed the Temple of Set were in the Church of Satan for some time. And apparently this was the only problem they had. All the other teachings, all the books, the lack of really information, the lack of structure, all the things that the Church of Satan really had, they were fine with. They didn't want Anton LaVey to make money. So it's just as simple as that, which is, as I said, I think that's counter everybody and certainly counter Satanism. So what is the foundation to this? I have to say, well, if this is some sort of Nazi group based on Nazi philosophies, why would they pick Arabic or Egyptian god forms? That seems to go against their belief systems. Now, you've got to understand what a Nazi is and what, quote, Deutschlanders or Germans are. They are they call themselves Aryans. Aryans means that you are an Arab. You come from Persia. Now, the Persians don't consider themselves Arabs. This is like saying, well, I'm not an American, I'm a Southerner. So the whole idea is that regardless of that, they're Middle Easterners. So that's where they come from. They don't call themselves German. German basically came from the Italian general, Germani, who was a huge area of Europe, was the Germani area. So there's a great misunderstanding of what German means. So German is a large part of Europe that includes the French, the Belgians, all these kind of areas. This was all Germania. The country of Germany, which is misnamed, is generally called Deutschland, which is a Persian word. So, and the people that settled in this area call themselves Aryans, not Anglo-Saxons, not Norse, not anything else. They immigrated from a particular area, and they're Arabs. Their language is Arabic. The way they write things is Arabic. So it has to be very clear, because that's important to understand that apparently nobody gets. People think that when you talk about Nazis, you're thinking about white power. Now, white power was never mentioned in any Nazi literature. They deliberately picked the word Aryan because they came from this particular place in the Middle East. They look like them. They have the stature of them. And you got to remember, though, that this is Europe. And the Germans, who pretty much always lost every battle they ever got into, were invaded by everybody. They ran all over Europe. So you get places that have been occupied, depending on the time of that. There are times when Sweden was trying to take over all of Europe. I guess you never heard about that, did you? 1700s. And they invaded large parts of Germany, particularly the Hamburg area, which is where you're going to find big Germans today that have kind of light hair and blue eyes, because they were Nordics taking over that area. So the whole idea is that anytime you do any kind of research, and if you look at the history of the Germans, they are aligned 100% with Islam and always have been. Their buddies, the Turks, which are 40% of the population, are Arab, is the way it works. Now, I don't necessarily want to get into that, but it's part of this essential thing, because the bottom line is that Michael Aquino went to Himmler's castle and did rituals there to empower his temple of Set. You think he would go to Egypt somewhere? No. But of course, it was too much trouble for him, being a military guy that could easily get into Germany. He went over to this castle to one of the most disgusting people on the planet, Heinrich Himmler, who was the architect and murdered at least 12 million people. At least 6 or 7 were Jews, and of course a whole bunch of other people, not to mention all the other people that were murdered in World War II by his group of people, the otherwise known as the SS. And that's important to understand, but I don't want to drag too much of that in there. But the SS went from town to town, murdering entire towns of people from all through Central Europe and all the way into even Italy and Greece, where they took entire towns and murdered people. They hung the men, they put the women and children in buildings and set them on fire. That's the history. And of course, the Weimar was involved with this as well, who murdered over 3 million Russians as well, who they had as prisoners. So it goes on and on and on of the real history of what's going on. But this is what this is. But it's important to understand this. Now, if Aquino wants to look the other way of what the true nature of this guy was, taking his dramatic Hollywood view of him shows you the kind of poor intellectual he was. But he's very quick to criticize how this all went wrong. And to a certain extent, I understand that viewpoint as well. Well, it was this great thing. Now, if you read about the skewed history of Nazism, well, these are these people who wanted to go back to paganism. They wanted to be one with the earth. They wanted to have different control over things. The problem is that got perverted into taking over the world. It would have been a great experiment if they would have kept themselves to their own country and see what they could have done. But the bottom line is they know they couldn't do anything. They're lazy, incompetent people that needed slaves to do everything. And that's exactly what it was all about. 13,000 people died building Himmler's castle or rebuilding it there. Slaves, particularly most Jews and Slavics and other ones that were worked to death, tortured and murdered horribly, as was done through all these things. Oh, let's just overlook that. I kind of like it. Symbolism. He drives on the floor. It's so pretty. We could put some white curtains on the side here. This is the kind of thing that we have to be very careful of. He also is not a very good student of that entire Deutschlander reality. Edred Flowers was the same way, who spent a lot of time in Germany, apparently went to a university in there, and the first thing he did was join the Sadomasochism Society. So the Desaad Society, and got involved with the Saturnist group, one of these reverse Satanist type groups, using Saturn as some of them do. That's the first thing he did. So you can see how these people immediately did that. And he took over the trapezoid order, which is kind of interesting. And it just shows you kind of stupid these people are as well. You know, there's this whole movement but I don't want to get into it. Let's move away from that. In the trapezoid comes from, which is amusing, H.P. Lovecraft. Like, people think H.P. Lovecraft wrote an anti-occult book with Houdini, and the only reason it wasn't published because Houdini died before it could get published. You're talking about taking comic books and using its symbolism. It's ridiculous. This is fiction. They did the same thing with virile energy. It's all nonsense. The other thing is the distortion of, which is not their God forms. And of course, even today, Edred Flowers, and Aquino was getting into it as well, is into where they come from, Iran. They're into Iranian mythology, and ultimately, all the things that the Deutschlanders believe in comes from Iran. That's their culture. That's why they call themselves Aryans. Now, this doesn't come from me. This is a statement of fact. But that's where the Temple of Set's ground was. You've got this lunatic military guy, 1 grade under a general, by the way, collecting a big salary, using your money to go to places in Germany where he was stationed to go and do his little rituals, and one of the darkest, evilest things. The kind of atrocities committed by the SS are unfathomable. So the whole idea is that this is what he's channeling, because this was some guy who talked about his black priesthood and all this stuff, the Black Grail, and they talk about the Temple of Set and everything. They talk about the black flame, and this is what they talk about Satan as the ultimate energy and the black flame. Everything comes from the darkness and the black. That's all part of Satanism, and certainly part of the Temple of Set. So they built this whole thing on what is considered, and of course they will never say this, but they're using Egyptian stuff because it's based on the same Middle Eastern background that all of these people come from, based in this bizarre Deutschlander German nonsense. So he had no problem grabbing onto that because of that. And so it's based on that. Now, what is the organization? It's very hard to separate Michael Aquino from the organization because he made up the whole thing. And he states that there was no system of honoring Set or rituals connected to it. There's virtually nothing from ancient Egypt that you can find that relates to any kind of rituals, and certainly very little about Set. So he contrived the entire system together to do that. And so they considered starting another church called that had the name Satan in it and other things, and decided to go with this. Yet they do use the upside down pentagram, which certainly as their symbol, which is kind of ironic because it has absolutely nothing. It's not an Egyptian symbol, and I don't think it's ever been seen there. So the bottom line is that they're using a typical, but of course they have no imagination. There's nothing that Michael Aquino or any of these other people ever come up that's original. And that goes for all of these dictator type things, these dark energy people. Nothing original comes from them, just like there's not a single original thing that's ever come out of Deutschland or Germany. Nothing. They've copied everything. Everything they make is backwards and primitive. They're as good. So this is very typical, and Michael Aquino is no different from that. Nor is Edred Flowers, who runic books. He just copied from the old German books of the 30s. They're almost identical, by the way. Nothing new comes out of there. He got involved with the Armenin system, which is where all the Nazis are in, and so forth. So it's the same old story there. Nothing new. None of his writing is new. Nothing is interesting. And you can read about, and I will leave a link down below where Aquino explains the Temple of Set in his own words, and you can find out what their kind of philosophy and meaning is. Now, that's all well and good, but when it's applied, what does it mean? So when people use negative stuff and then try and turn it positive to kind of thumb their nose at society, I just find that kind of strange. The problem is what are you supposed to do? Join the Catholic Church or some other organization? Well, we already know they're highly corrupt and there's nothing you can do. So, as I said, just like the church has created Satanism. So, just like the police have created crime because they support crime. So, the whole idea is that these are one of the problems with what do you do as an alternative system, but there's a lot of all. You could start your own nice organization, or nice based with higher principles, instead of saying, we're going to go into the darkness and go in the lowest, and we're going to manifest the best out of the shittiest. What? I just don't quite understand all that. And, but these are, Aquino's quite a character who's been able to make his mark on life. He changed the American flag patches on uniforms to put them backwards. So, which people, they're not backwards, they're moving forward. Nonsense. That was new since Aquino changed that. He wrote in that the religion of Satanism to be part of the military chaplains, and actually wrote the chaplain's book on how to do this. So he's made his influence. He's been linked to so many things. Well, of course, we just don't know how much of this is true. People are linked to everything. It doesn't mean that they are there. But there's a lot of strange coincidences that have to be looked at. Now, the Temple of Set, like all these organizations, you just really don't know. They really, when you get down to it, they have memberships of a few hundred around the world. I tend to think that that is a very low number. There's probably tens of thousands of people that follow these beliefs basically. Are they members of the church? Well, no. Well, it's very difficult to go up the Temple of Set. So let's get back to that. You can join the Temple of Set relatively easily, but you're going to have to go through a lot of training and other things. And from what I understand, to move into leadership of the church, that you have to, and I don't believe this to be true, that you have to, but this is their doctrine, you have to be able to manifest a visible spirit. So you have to be able to do a ritual where a visible spirit shows up. Now, this is what they claim to move on, but this is a way to keep everybody out of leadership. Now, most organizations do this because they don't want sincere, maybe even good or nice people usurping the organization. They get in there, they do everything. Well, why aren't I allowed in leadership? Well, you can't do this, which is impossible. That's about what they set up for. Well, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to produce a spirit in visible form in a ritual. So it certainly is possible, and there are certain entities that can, there's all sorts of things that can happen, which I won't go into here. But that's part of what they do and part of how they can, interestingly, try to keep everybody out. So the Temple of Set apparently, and for what they claim, because Aquino apparently was in, I think was he still in college at that time, but it was formed in Santa Barbara, California, where he got his political science degree at UC Santa Barbara, and so forth. I'm not sure what's the dates there, but I happened to live up in that area and was going to college. I think I'm not so much after he was there, but there still was a presence there of this group and what was going on there, and several members there around there. But I never had much contact with them. I really had no use for Satanists in general, but you bump into them. So here's a guy, because it amuses me that the Process Church has been labeled by a really bad researcher called Maury Terry, who knows nothing about the occult, who's trying to go after the Process Church, which nothing has ever stuck to them. There's nothing they ever do it. They're a loud, obnoxious group of people that were everywhere, that were in your face, that preached a lot of shocking stuff, and to get attention. And they were everywhere, publishing magazines by the hundreds of thousands. But they never were really connected to anything. Yet they have been blamed for everything. But here we have a lieutenant colonel who has one of the highest clearance working at NORAD, and it's not a problem. Oh, well, it's his religion. There's nothing we can do about it. Really? And he's a Nazi. Really? Of course, he likes to deny that because that's against the military code to a certain extent. They don't consider that a security risk. You're started the head of a church, a Satanistic church. You're a Nazi, and that's okay. Let's give him a high clearance. Now, maybe you can't throw him out of the military because of a lot of nonsense, and of course, he had money to sue the military. But you certainly don't have to give him a big, high clearance, really. I know people have been turned out for clearances for the most minorest little problems they have. Yet here's a guy who's a total nut job who's at NORAD. Frightening. And, of course, nobody goes after him. They go after a church that of people who were like the Process Church that people worry about, which was started by a prostitute and a kind of a nut job prophet and a street guy. Scone it and draw it, yeah. Who was behind the business stuff, like Timothy Wiley. So the whole idea is that, and they get attacked. Well, I mean, yeah. Keep pointing to the red herring while this person has all this. So it's a lot of suspicious. This is a guy who's got power and used it even if in a minor way. He also had quite a following, not surprisingly, in the military from other military officers, particularly where he worked at. But he did work out in a lot of his times in the Presidio, which was in San Francisco. And this is where he was able to get a bunch of people to follow him him and who were other Satanists. But you remember there were drugs and sex involved. So you get a military guy, and that's all they do is hump and drink. So the whole idea is that I don't think it was too difficult to get them over to the Church of Satan, whatever was going on there. So this makes sure that all of these things are very confused. So, as I said, it's very difficult to separate the two. But there were several other people in the leadership of the Temple of Set as well, including, of course, his wife, who was an ex-model, apparently, who decided to become a Satanist because she was constantly being harassed sexually in the modeling business, which seems to be true, by the way, but she certainly didn't go back and thump those guys magically or otherwise. So this is what turned. But, everybody goes through that. So the whole idea to turn away from decency into non-decency, well, isn't that really the Satanic way? If you can manipulate people into sex and hold something over them, isn't that part of usurping your will? So I don't really understand that, or I should say pushing your will. So all of this is very confusing in terms of what. Now, he writes very dry, boring information, quoting every possible pseudo-intellectual source he can. Reading anything from Aquino about the Temple of Set is boring. So he turned it over. It had several leadership, and now they're under a new leadership who I'm not entirely sure who that is, but they've turned it over to several people. The last guy who ran it for many years was Don Webb. Now, Don Webb was a science fiction basic writer. He also wrote a lot of humor, and he wrote several books, which are all really bad and kind of jokey, and nothing is for real and nothing everything else. The same thing with Edred Flowers, otherwise known as Edred Thorson, in terms of his other books. He wrote a book on S&M magic, which is, of course, what he's into, and they don't say anything. It's like a sixth grader book. And this is what you'll find with almost everything. I've never been impressed by anything that any of these guys have written. I've read quite a bit of it. Edred Flowers' books on the runes and everything else are very typically scholarly works, and of course they're completely and totally copied from the German books. So, and even to the point of using the same setup for the chapters, they're almost identical. So there's nothing new there. His books on so-called sex and magic using S&M were absolutely nothing. He watches every single word he puts in there so that this book could be sold at Walmart. I mean, it's really low-level stuff. Now, I'm not sure what the Inner Order members are getting or not, but certainly stuff written by Don Webb and Edred Flowers are really the lowest level stuff. They're pretty much lower level than your average, very simplistic Wiccan books. So everything he's put out has been the same thing. He certainly hasn't broken any grounds on what he considers to be the great study of runes, because all of his books are pretty bad. They're all the same. He hasn't found any new ways of doing anything. So this is all basic stuff that's been copied, and nothing new is released, and that's their philosophy anyway. One of their problems is, and which is the nature of, quote, magical occult organizations, is that everything is kept secret. So it's kept secret, you don't talk about it, you don't discuss with other people, because there was a horrible persecution that went on. But generally, these are things like the Masons, that you have secrets, you keep them, and you don't let them out. It's as simple as that. You don't allow information to get out to non-initiates. And of course, I certainly understand that. I mean, we have these same kind of privacy situations with any business. What's in the secret sauce at McDonald's? What's in the Coca-Cola formula? Well, these aren't things that are given out, and there are practices within all sorts of companies that you don't discuss actually what goes on. It's amazing how these things are kept forever. How there are certain things within industries that people do and you don't share it because that's part of your industry. So, and that's part of the, quote, guild philosophy, which was an organization of people. Guild means money, was so that people were in an organization and you didn't give that out to others so that you could make money within the organization and organization alone. And of course, this makes sense. Everybody does this. Nobody gives out secrets. Nobody will tell you anything that could really help you. This is how the world goes. But it's all a little trade secret. So that's not unusual. And as mentioned, the Temple of Set, of course, was totally created. And a lot of their structure, their ritual magic practices were taken from the Golden Dawn and from the OTO. So he copied a lot of that. As I said, they had no imagination. I don't think he knew anything about, quote, magic or anything else. The Church of Satan really wasn't into serious ritual magic studies. He jumped over to the usual place where everybody takes their information from, and that's the Golden Dawn, who created their own fantasy system, but left enough for people to copy. It's considered the really the core of doing ritual magic. And the OTO is kind of a goofy organization, but again, it's been around a long time and had certain rituals and so forth that could be taken and used. And of course, that's exactly what he did. He has no imagination. All he did was go in there and use the term set. He also started out on a vengeance campaign against the Church of Satan, trying to discredit them as much as possible. I'm assuming he was trying to break them up as much as they possibly could so that members would run to him. And by disgracing Anton LaVey, this was a way to draw the members of that church and to get rid of them. In 1975, the temple was incorporated as a nonprofit church in California and got state and federal recognition and nonprofit status. So it is an official church and it is an official nonprofit. So this, I don't know if people know that, but it's not just an organization. He officially established that, which is pretty easy to do. You just fill out the papers for the IRS, and as long as you look semi-legitimate, they will allow that. As I mentioned, there's been several leaders. I mentioned Don Webb, but apparently in 1979, Aquino stepped away from the Temple of Set pretty quick after that. You're talking about only 4 years after establishing the Temple of Set, and gave it to Ronald Keith Barrett, who produced some books, which a lot of people said were very mystical and not very magical. Barrett's leadership was also criticized as authoritarian, resulting in a decline in the Temple's membership. So, as usual, when someone else steps in, people don't like it. So, he resigned in 1982. He was and subsequently established his own Temple of Anubis, which he led until 1998. And apparently, he until his 1998 death, it survived until 2010. When Barrett left, Aquino retook leadership of the Temple of Set and so forth. During this period, sociologist Jenny Graham Scott clandestinely participated in the temple, using her observations, which are all put into her book, The Magician's Study and Use of Power in a Black Magic Group. This is the girl he had an affair with and wrote a book on what actually is happening in the Temple of Set. So we highly recommend everybody getting that book so that you can figure out what are the what's really going on here. Because, everybody tells you something. They want to trap you into it. And then when they do that, they're on their own little trip. I mean, the OTO does this. The organization that Aleister Crowley took over, he didn't start it, but he took it over and he put in sex magic practices, which in itself is not necessarily bad, but it starts you out with masturbation moves you into heterosexual sex, and the highest degree is homosexuality. So they move you into that. That's what Aleister Crowley was into, and he wanted to breed a bunch of, at the very least, bisexual people that he could use. That was his thing. Now, the OTO, when you start off there, has all these kind of strange little rituals that are very bland and boring, basically, but this is what they're preparing you for, and there's no way of saying this isn't true. It's in their doctrine. So you got to be careful. Where are they leading you to? And there seems to have been a lot of change of leadership here. Apparently, Aquino wasn't too interested in running this as an organization himself, and probably wanted to kind of distance himself, or maybe just only do writing, because there was a lot of change in the organization. In 1995, Zina Scheck, the daughter of Anton LaVey, with her husband Nicholas Scheck, both who were very big critics of her father, and I'm not sure why, again, took over for a very short period of time, apparently. In 1996, Don Webb, who I've mentioned already, became the high priestess of the temple and had that position for apparently 6 years, which is long for that. But apparently nobody really wants to continue to do the job, and I'm sure there's probably no pay or anything else with it. He did write some books, and I'm assuming because he was a writer and made some money there for himself. He was replaced by Zina again, but she resigned after 6 weeks and was replaced by Aquino, who took charge once again. So he had to come back in to take over the organization. Zina has always been a strange, odd person who turned against her father for unknown reasons. And her entire history is pretty weird and strange. She and her husband, Nicholas, both live in Berlin now and run their own little weird groups there. So who knows what's really going on there. But here we get back to another German connection. The group she started called The Storm. I don't know if that's still going or not. I looked her up a little while ago, and it looks like she's just doing some psychic work and some tantric work. I don't know what's going on there. In 2004, and I don't know if she's still running, Patricia Hardy took over, who was elected to the position of Supreme Priestess. Although no longer in charge of the organization, Aquino nevertheless remained its most visible spokesman. So I'm not sure who's running it now, because you're talking about almost 20 years after 2004. So it's unknown of that. I'm not even sure that matters unless it's someone of any worth. As I said, Don Webb was there a while. You've got books he's written, as really terrible little books. He's a comic writer. I don't know how he fits in, but people like to appoint writers because that's what you have to put out there. You have to put out material, and the average person isn't very good at it. So this is all part of the process of how do you keep an organization going. As mentioned, the organization is set up like a traditional Golden Dawn organization. They still use 666. They still use Satan. They still use an inverted pentagram. It's amazing how they're not really using a lot of Egyptian understanding. But that may take a little more study on their parts, which is pretty much above the intellectual value of a Setnian who wants to use an Egyptian name and then wants to use symbols from traditional Judeo-Christian reverse practices of Satanism. It's the same old nonsense with these kind of people that seem to be very confused. But, again, they didn't set up anything new because they don't have the mentality to do that. So they went to the Golden Dawn where everybody goes. And, of course, that was a totally invented system, by the way. The Golden Dawn was created by a bunch of kind of floppy little rich Brit poets and writers who wanted to dress up in fancy outfits, and they put together a whole bunch of ritual magic practices, which they synergistically put together from a bunch of old texts. There was none, and as far as I know, there are no complete or original systems of worship, paganism. No, we know nothing about Druidism or anything else. All these things were totally destroyed and the practitioners were killed. So the same thing with everything with Egypt. I mean, we didn't even know what any of the Egyptian hieroglyphics were until we found the Rosetta Stone. People spent, 30, 40 years trying to figure out what all those symbols meant until that stone was uncovered. So we just don't know. So none of this was done as something new. He took from Crowley. He took most of his stuff from Anton LaVey, who he attacked pretty viciously, published all the negative things that Anton LaVey got involved with, including court documents, divorce papers, and everything else. And Michael Aquino wrote an entire book on the history of the Church of Satan and all the letters that he kept and everything that he was involved with, and has printed this, and you can buy this on Amazon if you're interested. He went into all the practices that Anton LaVey did, from being a filthy, dirty slob to beating his lions to all sorts of other terrible things that he was supposedly doing, that Anton LaVey was this kind of scummy guy. Which we have no idea of what that is. We do understand that the Aquino, who had a rich mommy who made money in the real estate business boom of San Francisco in the 70s and 80s, and left him a whole bunch of money and buildings and everything else, and that he was an Eagle Scout, and he was a guy that was a good student. And this is what the military loves. He could go to any school, pass it with high ranking, with great grades, and this is what they liked about him. So, I mean, there's nothing special about the Temple of Set. Now, they haven't been linked to doing anything negative that I've heard. Aquino, of course, has been in a lot of different places. Who you can say is the church. In the, I believe it was the Jeffrey McDonald case on the military base. This was the guy who was accused of murdering his family. Ironically or incidentally, Michael Aquino was there at the time of this strange murder. Well, that's kind of interesting. So he has been accused of, and apparently there's some information of the fact that of being allegedly involved, and we don't know, there was massive child molestation problems in the Presidio. And the building with the records in it burned down. There were children that identified him, etc., etc. And this was never followed through for one reason or another. So he's been linked there. I'm sure if we followed him in the different parts of the country, they could do what they did like with the Process Church, connect things because he was just there. We don't know. It's very difficult to find out any kind of cohesive information on him. He spent time in Vietnam, at different bases there, and it was talked that he was using magic to control areas, etc. Great gossip. We just don't know. It's highly unlikely. I don't see him as the great magician or the great magical person. He's an intellectual flop, is my opinion of him. I don't think he's done anything overly practical. After all, he spent this time in the military. I don't know if it was free time he had, but every time you listen to him, he doesn't talk very much detailed about what he can do or has done. He just talks around issues. You can't get anything out of him of any great value. And when it comes to anything like what did you see when you were at the missile command there, did you see any extraterrestrials and everything else? He backs away from that. Saying, I can't give out any information. I would be in serious, serious trouble. But tends to say, well, we didn't really see anything that would be of note for you. So the fact that he had these kind of clearances and everything else, he was in Vietnam. We don't know what his war record is. We don't know what he did. He was discharged with an honorable discharge and given a service cross for doing good work, which figures. But all that we just don't know. After he retired out of the military, and he's written a lot of books, if you want to read them, that you can buy right off of Amazon. Books, some theory books like What Happens If the Nazis Won the War, his great sympathy for the Nazis, even though he likes to criticize them, saying they went wrong. He's got all sorts of books that he's written and books on mind wars and so forth. All of these books are out there, and you can find them on Amazon inexpensively by getting, I think, many of them are Kindle. Let's go into a little greater detail there, because there's not much to say about the Temple of Set. They didn't do anything. We don't know what they're linked to. They're secretive. He's military. They've had many leaders. The amount of leaders they've had, and even to this day, I mean, it shows an organization that really isn't well organized or has a great following. They do not have tens of thousands of members. They probably have worldwide, if we want to give them a little credit, 500, 600 members maybe. That doesn't mean they don't have a lot of sympathizers. But in terms of card-carrying members, people in the organization, well, it really wasn't structured that way. Aquino didn't need any money, and I'm assuming that all these leaders aren't paid, so they just leave. Don Webb was smart enough to write books so he could make some money on it. I'm assuming he got the money from those books and wrote little quickie, easy books because he's a writer. But I'm assuming there's no pay going with this, so nobody stays there very long. Keno had to come back in. Now, Keno can't come back in because he's dead now. And apparently Satan and Set didn't think that he should live long and carry on the tradition, because he died in his early 70s from colon cancer that he was suffering from for many years, so we understand. There's some talk that he may have, he's been very sick, but he may have shot himself because of the pain and because of how much he was suffering. That's just gossip, and I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. When you get really sick, and there's no hope, which at this point there wasn't any, well, that's not a criticism to do it. But he does have a Mind Wars, which is his military intelligence things. And, he gets back to a very crybaby attitude of, it's amazing how many military people read that, write books that say, we ought to get along and take care of each other. In the meantime, I'm going to kill you. Like the first Earth Battalion books that were written, which was a sarcastic book of how to trick the enemy to kill them, which people misunderstood. He wrote a version of the Satanic Bible, 50th Anniversary Revision. Not sure what's in there. Temple of Set, he's got books on their beliefs and practices, which you can get. And a lot of these, these are on Amazon that you can buy directly. I don't see how. It looks like a lot of his other books have disappeared, but a lot of these are on Kindle Unlimited. So you can join Kindle Unlimited, which I think is like $10 a month, and you can read all his books, and because they don't charge you for each individual book. So for $10, you could read every one of his books: Mind War, even the Satanic Bible, the Temple of Set, Book 2, Find Far. Not sure what is that one about. Let's check that out. But that was the follow-up, I believe, to Mind Wars, which was his first kind of published books which have a military overtone. It's interesting because, they always have this, as I said, with these crybaby military guys that want to tell us that we should all stop fighting. We've got, this book, Find Far, is a practical technology for reducing, if not completely eliminating, the scourge of physical warfare affecting humanity by neutralizing violent irrationality in the human subconscious and replacing it with an impulse to creative cooperation. Now, he thinks he's going to do this from some mind control. But that's the typical type of writing. I can see that he definitely wrote this intro to the ad for the book, because that's the kind of psychobabble, big word talking he does that impress the military. It is interesting. Let's see if he's got his other, but he wrote a whole bunch of other Mind Star. Oh, here we go. Now we're getting We Break the Sword, Nazi Peace. The Nazi Peace of 1940. These are the kind of things that he has written, and I mean, there's a lot of. War is the art of science of resolving international political and military crises through the application of psychological control. So here we go again. The same old thing of this psychological control, which is really naive to think that we're going to change mankind who for hundreds of thousands of years has been in this. So, he's talking about how to prevent all these wars and how to use this, with all of this type of pseudo-intellectual nonsense. That people are going to start thinking rationally. And again, we break the sword, the Nazi peace of 1940, Kindle Unlimited, Mindstar, Kindle Unlimited. So all of these things, you can read his entire library for a very small amount of money. And even if you take a month or two, you can get all those books there. Temple of Set 1, which talks about that, his original Mind War book. And some of these are available other places. I may leave a link down below. Overthrowing the Old God, Aleister Crowley, and the Book of Law, written with Don Webb and Michael Aquino. That is not on that program. And we will look at Don Webb's stuff here. But he has all these books on Amazon that you can get very inexpensively. And there are more here. The Fire Force, another novel. There's a whole bunch of stuff that, when he retired from the military officially and the Temple of Set stepped back, he's got a whole 2 volumes on the Church of Satan. Let's see, you got here Extreme Prejudice, which talks about the accusations against him for these child molestation charges. There's a lot of stuff here that he has written, and if you want to find out more about him, and the neutron bomb, Fire Force, a Star Wars parody, Rosicrucianism reawakened. So he's taken this very mediocre kind of low-level occultism, moving away from this hardcore Satanism and what goes with it. And it's a very intellectual way of looking at things. But, can you trust any of these people? He comes off as the nicest kind of guy, just like David Berkowitz, who shot people. What does all this mean? The fact of that we need to think rationally and not be drawn into fake religions and other things. Well, all this makes sense, but is that really? And why are you doing that? Why don't you start an organization that has less baggage with it? And why were you a member of the Church of Satan, which is basically a party, drug, sex organization, which is what attracted you and your fellow little officers to the debauchery that went on there. So what are we supposed to make of all that? And let's see what old Don Webb, punch in here, wrote. I'm not sure what all of that means with all of the different writings he made, because he had Uncle Set's, let's see what else he's written here. Energy Magic of the Vampire, Secret Techniques for Personal Power and Manifestation, which is, write down the actual satanic belief system of control, etc. And he's getting back into what else he's got here. Strange Altars, based on Lovecraft and Burroughs' writings. more fantasy stuff because they don't know anything about magic. They can't write anything about magic. It's in terms of building something new or interesting. Living magic, insights and experience from practicing magicians. These are all done by himself personally, personally published. Overthrowing the Old Gods, Return of the Old Ones, Lovecraftian stuff again, yawn. Conquer the Womb, Lusty Tales. Is that him? No, that's not him. Okay, we've moved somewhere else. Let's see if there's anything else here that we can find. I thought there were a few books on magic, but he talks about magic here, and particularly this sounds interesting. Experiences from practicing magicians. Is that he's under Frater UD Don Webb? Now I don't know if that's a Setian degree or not. A lot of people use that Frater. Now, is that coming from teachings of the temple? I doubt it, because he's not really allowed to use those. The Seven Faces of Darkness he wrote, which is a book on Setian magic. Set is on the cover. This goes back 10 years ago or so to that. So let's see what else has he written there. Uncle Seton's Uncle Setnati's Essential Guide to the Left-Hand Path. So, that's done. And that was you got to remember that he was ran the Temple of Set for. He also wrote a book called The Mysteries of the Temple of Set. So this, gives you an insight. But how much of this is true is not. This is all stuff that you cannot let out of your temple. He was the head of the temple. How much he's going to give you with this is hard to say in terms of what kind of value is there. So everything is hidden, everything is vague, everything is loose, unless you get actual inner documents that you're not allowed to release. So Webb himself is an odd guy. He's a writer that's written all sorts of strange and different books, so to speak. He won the International Horror Critics Award. He's written a lot of short stories. He's definitely the writer. And I don't know if ironically or not, or just expectedly, he's a Texan, which ought to tell you a lot to be in a... which ought to give you information, again, of the Illuminati roots that these people come from, as is, Edred Flowers, another Texan. So it's very interesting that you're going to find these groups there and how they're connected and all the things to go with it. So, so the doctrine of the Temple of Set in itself is rooted in typical Satanism, glorification of the self is the greatest, you can become your own God, you can do anything you want in life. It's, it's a bizarre, positive thinking, self-help reality based in drawing energy not from positive things of the light, but drawing from the black, dark flame, and that you draw from the darkness. That's the satanic reality of life, and you can hear certain people say that who are Satanists. They're going to say, well, you don't draw from the light, you draw from the dark. So this is where you can find out if someone's a Satanist or not. But drawing from the darkness, of course, goes against all understanding of metaphysical and magical powers, because you're dealing from the negative, the destructive, not the building. It doesn't make you successful. It doesn't make you energize you. This is what you use to bring negative energy. to people and things. So it doesn't make sense in all that area. So this is one of these bizarre things. And, I understand Aquino doing this. And, of course, you got to remember that everything is based on the Church of Satan and on the Golden Dawn. Nothing new is here. His babbling writing and a few other people that have been involved in this, because these people represent the Temple of Set and what they're doing. So Don Webb's work and the different books he's written and the magical styles will give you an insight into some of the practices and what they were doing, but we just don't know. I mean, the basic law of any order is you don't give out information. Now, how much he has extrapolated on and put into these different books would be interesting, and it would be interesting what he considers. Now, not going to find any shocking stuff in there. You're not going to find public books that talk about debased torture, debased sexuality, debased anything. These people involved in this organization in particular are smart. They're relatively professional. They're not going to come out and state anything weird or odd that can tie them into legal problems, etc. The problem is what's going on. Now, Satanism in general, which goes up very high into secretive, debased, horrible practices, is also on the street level, which is enforcing it throughout the world, where street gangs are basically gangs of Satanists or tied in with their leaders who have satanic leanings and are kind of this mixture of criminal organizations that do pretty much everything. So, doing human sacrificing, murdering babies, it's not that much further than the kind of abuse, human trafficking, rape houses, all the things that these criminals are into. And to think that they're not into Satanism would be kind of naive. But this group tries to keep the higher level, as Aquino did for most of his life. He really was never tracked to anything directly. There are some weird, he was at many places that apparently things happened at, which is quite coincidental. As I've mentioned, the McDonald murders at a military base, and he happened to be there, so it is alleged. Lots of child molestations at the Presidio, and he apparently was around there as well at that time that it's been alleged. And there are a bunch of other things like that. But to think that these people are getting involved in more criminal practices directly, well, they support these people, and we just don't know what they're doing. And, there were people who talked about his strange apartment in San Francisco, particularly children, where he had a black wall and an upside-down cross on it and all the things that identified. I mean, this is pretty strange stuff that someone would know. This isn't just a normal apartment. So we just don't know what's going on with him. And of course, now that has passed, we don't know, period. Secrets are kept by all sorts of groups, and it's near impossible to get any real information. And even someone comes forward and say, well, I know this person did this. Well, that's their opinion. There's no way to prove that. So it becomes a kind of a gossip from someone who may not like that person, is trying to be special himself or whatever. So how do you know anything? But Aquino is very similar to the Process Church in the fact that nothing has ever stuck to him. There's a lot of innuendos without anything really being proven. So we just don't know. Getting back to the new leader, Patricia Hardy, who apparently has taken the actual Set Church into a very Egyptian reality. Now, I saw some video with a black woman there. I'm not sure if that's Patricia Hardy or not. I'm trying to find other information, but that's who may be running it. She took it over 20 years ago. It's hard to believe that she still would be there. The problem is that's a fairly common name. Even though I've been able to get some information, there is a statistics person at name that who's a black woman who looks like the same one that was actually speaking as a spokesman for the Temple of Set, but I don't really know. So I think it's difficult to, I'm sure she wouldn't want to be labeled that if she's not. So we just don't know who this person is, who's basically involved at this particular time from what we can find easily here. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time who's doing what. If you want, but it does state that some person named this was actually doing lots of investigations in Egypt and was able to find a priesthood of Set there and other Egyptian architects proving the worship of and the following of the Egyptian Satan, otherwise known as Set. So this seems to come together and make sense. And if that's the case, it looks like they're spending their time going back into an area of research, which I'm not sure is interesting or not, linking, going back, instead of into Satanism, Judeo-Christian practices and this Nazi stuff, they're moving into Egyptian studies in general, which of course, where else are they going to go if you're going to call yourself the Temple of Set and then use Judeo-Christian symbols like Aquino did? Because it didn't seem like he was too much into Egyptian stuff, and it didn't seem like he spent a lot of time going to Egypt, from what I can track. He had a big farm in Scotland. He spent a lot of time in Germany with the free tickets from the U.S. military, and all the things that were there. It didn't seem like there was any mention that much of, even though it is in the books to a degree, but there wasn't so much research being done into Egyptian roots of things, because I don't think he was very interested in that. Certainly, his second in command there at that time, who is no longer there, Edred Flowers, was definitely a person with strong alleged Nazi roots, and said that has nothing to do with anything else. It has to do with his background of this so-called. Of course, he didn't understand what Aryanism was, but the whole idea is that that's exactly what they're moving into. Now, what they're doing now and where they go, you got to remember Aquino has been sick for a long time. He has passed away. What does that mean for where is the temple going? So he doesn't have a voice anymore. I don't think his wife is involved. I don't read much about her. She must be old and up there as well. I'm sure she's enjoying the money that was left to her for whatever life she has. She could have 10, 15 years, but there doesn't seem to be any mention of her in terms of the fact of her doing much for the church. She being an ex-model, she was kind of the pretty face of the Set group. He was known to have affairs and other things. I don't know how strong the relationship was, but she doesn't seem to be a prominent person. Now, if anybody has any information, make sure you put it down in the comments here or contact me, and I'm more than happy to add anything or correct anything that I may have said that is incorrect. We want to get the story out. What is this about? What is behind it? But like any secretive organization, what are they about? I mean, we have all sorts of secretive organizations, that have been linked to all sorts of horrific things. I mean, the CIA was supposed to be here to protect us. Yet Kennedy had great problems with them and started a counter organization because the CIA just went out and armed themselves and started to do physical things instead of collecting data and intelligence. They then started to do all sorts of things against their own population. So if you go to the CIA today, and which is a big organization, and you join them, well, certainly you can become a clerk or an intelligence officer. But what is going on behind the scenes? There are groups within groups. This is what happened with the Masons. The Masons in any group have been highly infiltrated. The Masons as a general group have some good, interesting philosophy that makes sense. Yet they've been accused of everything. And I'm sure there are, and from what I've been told, radical, dangerous groups within there that do bad stuff. But I've known a lot of Masons, and they're good people trying to do good work as a kind of a club. And they've raised money for sick people and other things. So, but is that all of them? Well, it's probably most of them. But there are certain groups within groups. And of course, when you allow these groups to splinter and they're not based on any code of morality, they can do anything. Once you get that power, this is what happens, of course, within all the military and police. They have all this power and it just corrupts them. They just grab the money and run, and it's as simple as that. So what what that's all about and what the internal functions of the Temple of Set and what they've been involved in is unknown. Certainly, Aquino is a character, a person who had a great deal of power in his own place, apparently was never harassed within the military, never was put down, stationed in Alabama or Alaska. He went where he wanted to, and they saw no problem with him because he had this outer intelligence and went to all these schools and passed with flying colors. His strange haircut, his eyebrows, and even apparently were wearing some strange black uniforms at the Presidio was all overlooked and nobody cared. Why? Is that what the military is all about? Well, I've heard a lot of alternative stories, and considering the kind of abusive, hillbilly, right-wing Christian type attitudes that the military has, it's hard to believe a guy like this could function unless he was doing something that he was told to, or they were deliberately allowing him to do it because this was what they wanted. So this all comes into of what it is. Now, if what appears is the Church of Satan, so the Temple of Set now, has moved into this particular area of Egyptian. But of course, the Temple of the Trapezoid Order is the Nazi order. It is this, which is still part of the organization. And of course, other people are running it now. We just don't know what's happening with any of this stuff. It does seem to be still operating. The Trapezoid Order and the Temple of Set are still there, and there is information on this and people. And I will also give you a link where you can get more information on it. But about 4 years ago, there was still a lot of information on the Trapezoid Order. I'm assuming is going. These things don't die out very easily, but that's a misconception if you don't quite understand what's going on. They don't die out, but nobody has a lot of membership. People aren't following through anywhere. Alternative organizations don't have a lot of interest in them. And from what I can see, the Temple of Set's a little too difficult, a little too organized, and has a very highbrow group of people in it. When you get into the lower ranks, the E.A. Kinetic groups and his connections and all the people involved in radionics that are Satanists and so forth, well, these don't take much commitment, and all you have to do is buy a few toys and watch a few things, and you're there. So there's a large following of common Satanists, and what they're into, we don't know. Most people get involved in these groups don't really understand what they're really talking about. They get caught into, well, here's a lot of power. You're going to be able to, again, the ego thing. You're going to be a god. You're going to have power over other people. You're going to influence them. And of course, you need that in life. But, there's a happy medium there, and you got to be careful where that goes. And the people that think like that, or at least express it, generally aren't people seeking power for the betterment of themselves and the world. They're seeking very egotistical empowerment, and these kind of people have a lot of following. The E.A. Kinetics and his group of people, you can buy his stuff relatively inexpensive. A lot of people follow this, and this then turns into being connected to people who are pretty unstable and do things like murders, etc. So, which he's been linked, or not linked to, but people who follow him. But that's kind of normal if you think about it. So it's all very interesting. I'm not sure from what my understanding is that they're really not a prominent organization. Once Aquino is gone, the lifeblood of the Temple of Set is history. What's taken over now is a frightening group of criminal gangs that are, quote, Satanist followers, using magic, tying in that group, and controlling the entire industry of metaphysics and Satanism and all the publishers. They all work with these criminals who feed them money and everything else, and being poor occultists, they're easily brought into it. So that's what's happening here in the popularity of E.A. Kinetic and others is irrefutable. He sells a lot of books. He has a lot of followers, and in the kind of smaller picture. I'm not what a lot means, but he certainly is doing a good business and has a lot of supporters and people that are following this particular path of different degrees of class and education that are out there. So this is irrefutable. This is what's out there. The Temple of Set is a highbrow organization with a bunch of pseudo-intellectuals, and they're not going to allow a bunch of street-level bums like E.A. Kinetti come in there, who has no education, who's done nothing, and in terms of the sophisticated world, they're not going to let these people into the Temple of Set on any great degree, and they're going to make sure they filter people out by forcing them to study, which nobody wants to do. So all of this is part of it, but of course, like everything, EA has his many, many problems, and he's finding out that his group of people are just as unreliable as everybody else, and most of these are kind of strange, undedicated people in general. But they are out there, they are well known, and there is a fair amount of flow of money for Satanism in general, but not really the Temple of Set. I mean, they've got their writings, they've got everything else. Where are they going with it? So I'm not sure what their structure is. I'm not sure what it costs to join. All these things, if you can even join now. This is all part of the reality of what's happening in general. But it's difficult to get, quote, followers. People buy stuff, but going through a system and staying with it and training yourself is generally not something that most people do. Now, I have looked up, I guess I should have looked it up initially here, their website here in terms of members. So they are taking membership. They still have a P.O. box in San Francisco. And it is Temple of Set Executive Director, so they're not giving anybody's names. It's $100 a year. You have to send in a particular, they like, of course, for you to be known by somebody else. It's a very simple little form, but they want information on your background, state your reason for deciding to seek entrance to the Temple of Set. So they have all these things. I'm not sure what this means. They want a photo copy of an ID, like a driver's license. They want the application signed. You have a little essay you write about yourself and why you want to go there. It's $100 to do that. So there's nothing going to be difficult about that. I don't know how many people they reject, and they do want to see an ID of yourself, which is not a bad idea. I mean, there certainly are problems with these kind of organizations. There's 2 short forms. I mean, you could probably do this in a couple of hours, so it's not like it's that much. How many people they reject, I have no idea. But they want to know who you are and why you're going in there, which certainly is acceptable. So apparently they are up and operating. This site is copyrighted to 2020, so it's about 2 years ago at the time of this recording. And they are still taking active members. You got to be 18 years of age, the usual stuff. And they have basic information here, etc. And of course, they do have, of course, there is their website. They do have their email, etc. And they do have reading lists, other things. Apparently, there's a lot of information written by Don Webb that you can read little articles there, etc. So all of this is is pretty much out there. It's still operating, whatever that means, and there are that links to inform yourself of what that. But what is really happening? Well, that's always the big question. What's really happening with all? Are there practices What are they doing behind the scenes? Is just this intellectual, I want to be a god thing, or are there more things to it than that? We just don't know. Most of these kind of organizations that are public, I don't believe are involved in any nefarious activities. It just doesn't make much sense. There is a whole group of Satanists that are doing all the debauchery that are basically criminal organizations that are international, and they're working with agencies around the world. Particularly, they work with so-called police departments around the world. They are directly connected with it and work for bankers and the Illuminati. So they're all kind of combined together, where they all work together to harass and to support criminal behaviors of all the most horrible type you can think of. But those are not these public groups. These public groups are not involved with this, even though you're going to attract a certain group of people that are potentially problematical. So that should give you a lead. I'll have some links down below for those that want to go further.